Most folks in Beaufort knew the Moore family by their famous diner. Fewer remembered they had 2 daughters. The sun was still rubbing sleep from its eyes when Ellie Moore unlocked the front door of Moore's Diner. The bell above the frame gave a reluctant jingle, soft and familiar. Inside, the air was a quiet blend of yesterday's bacon grease and floor polish, with just a trace of cinnamon clinging to the seat cushions from the last pie delivery. Ellie moved with a gentle precision, like someone folding memory into muscle. She started the coffee in the old glass pot, her father insisted it tasted better that way, and then filled the napkin holders while the drip line hissed. She flipped through the supply sheets, scrawled updates on a legal pad, and checked off vendor invoices one by one. The pen in her hand barely paused, even as she noticed the flicker of the neon open sign starting to buzz overhead. The diner had been part of the Moore family for nearly 4 decades. It had survived floods, 2 hurricanes, and an ill-advised karaoke brunch experiment in the late 90s. The town had changed, but the diner stayed a constant. Red vinyl booths. Black and white tiled floors. Pie display case spinning like it had a purpose. Most folks in Beaufort didn't remember a time before it. Candace always made sure they remembered who stood at the front of it now. At 7:35, right on cue, the door jingled again. Candace Moore breezed in, sunglasses still on despite the indoor lighting. She carried herself like a celebrity no one had asked for but everyone still noticed. "Smells like tradition," she said, stretching. Or is that just Ellie's sensible shoes? Ellie didn't look up from the order board she was adjusting. She slid a fresh chalk into the holder and made a quiet note about switching the sweet tea vendor. Candace moved to the counter like she owned the place, which, in some ways, she did. Customers smiled. One of the regulars, Barry from the post office, clapped his hands and said, "Our Iron Chef has arrived." Candace beamed. "What can I say? Beaufort's hungry for flair." Harold Moore emerged from the back hallway, adjusting his suspenders and balancing a copy of the Beaufort Gazette under his arm. He glanced at the clock, nodded to himself, and sniffed the air approvingly. "You smell that?" he asked Diane, who followed with a tray of jelly packets. "It's Candace's new sweet potato hash," Diane said proudly, setting the tray down. "She tested it last night. Customers are going to love it." Ellie paused. That recipe was hers, something she'd scribbled weeks ago after analyzing sales data. She'd filed it under test batch, Sunday brunch, and left it on the planning clipboard. Apparently, it had become Candace's latest inspiration. No one mentioned that. Mrs. Leona arrived at her usual booth by the window. Ellie slipped her a coffee, black, 2 sugars on the side, before she could ask. "You move like a ghost," Leona said, patting Ellie's wrist. "One of these days, they'll notice how much quieter it gets when you're not here." Ellie offered a small smile, then returned to counting cutlery at the side station. Near the lunch rush, Ellie caught the low murmur of her father's voice from behind the pie counter, speaking to a visitor in khakis and a name badge. "Local newspaper." "She's a force, that Candace," Harold said, puffing up. "Always knew she had it in her. Born to lead." Ellie's Moore, background help. Quiet, steady. Every family's got one. Ellie didn't flinch. She just folded the clean dish towel a little slower. After the close, the diner dimmed into silence. Ellie wiped the counters methodically, resetting sugar caddies and rotating the pies. The last to leave, as usual. In the break room, she pulled out her worn laptop and opened a folder named Possibilities. Inside was a lease application she drafted weeks ago for an empty warehouse just off Main Street. Brick facade, terrible lighting, plenty of space. She'd never told anyone she'd toured it. Never told anyone she'd dreamed of something beyond the corner booth in her family's shadow. The email from the owner blinked unread in her inbox. The subject line, "Contract ready for signature." Ellie hovered her mouse, then clicked. Later that night, she sat at her small kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space. The lease lay printed beside a mug of cooling tea. She read every word twice, then picked up her pen. Ellie signs the lease with a quiet smile. "Guess it's time to build something of my own." The warehouse was dusty, forgotten, and full of cobwebs, much like everyone's idea of Ellie's ambition. The back streets behind Beaufort's courthouse were quieter than Main Street, lined with aging brick storefronts and oak trees that creaked even without wind. A tilted sign that once read, "Perry's Hardware," leaned above a door that stuck just enough to need a hard push with the shoulder. Ellie stepped inside and paused, the musty air stirring as if startled by her presence. The warehouse was bigger than she remembered. Sunlight slanted in through high, warped windows, catching in layers of dust that swirled like old secrets. Wooden shelves lined the far wall, still holding rusted paint cans and an empty bird's nest. The floor creaked in some spots, groaned in others. But Ellie didn't see disrepair. She saw possibility. She walked the perimeter, arms folded, scanning the ceiling, the beams, the space where a coffee bar could live, where seating could wrap around bookshelves. She paused at a patch of wall where the brick had worn smooth and closed her eyes. A sign would go there, elegant, gold lettering. Elm and Vine. Outside, the faint clatter of wind chimes from the courthouse steps echoed through the alley. Ellie stepped back into the daylight, squinting into the fall glare. Across the street, a man in flannel was hauling crates from the back of a pickup. His beard had gone mostly silver, and a red carpenter's pencil stuck behind his ear like it had always lived there. "Jonas Green," she called. He turned, brow furrowed, until recognition broke through. "Ellie Moore," he said slowly. "Haven't seen you since your dad made me pay extra for a half slice of cherry pie." She smiled. "You said you were cutting back." "He took you literally." Jonas chuckled once, short and dry. "What brings you to this part of town?" "I have a proposition," Ellie said. "One that includes tools, sawdust, and a whole lot of coffee." Jonas followed her inside the warehouse. He ran his hand along the railing of an old staircase, tested a floorboard with the heel of his boot. "It's got bones," he admitted. "But it's tired. This place needs more than a facelift." "I don't want it to be flashy," she said. "I want it to feel like it's always been here, just waiting." Jonas shrugged. "Why me?" Ellie reached into her bag and pulled out a faded photo, black and white, edges curled. It showed a woman in a floral dress sitting in booth number 3 at Moore's Diner, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, smile wide and full of life. She loved that booth, Ellie said. "You rebuilt it yourself after the plumbing leak in '08. She said it felt better than before. Jonas's face softened. Mary always said it wasn't about how things looked, but how they felt. That booth was her anchor. "I want this place to feel like that," Ellie said quietly. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked the length of the room, tapped on the window frame, looked up at the ceiling. "You buy the nails. I'll bring the glue." Later that night, Ellie sat cross-legged on the floor with a sketch pad in her lap. The outline of elm and vine took shape in pencil, open shelving, low tables, soft corners. A menu followed, seasonal pastries, handcrafted teas, savory brunches with a twist of southern and restraint. She texted a photo of it to Sophia, her college friend now head pastry chef in New York. Within seconds, a reply, "I'm in. Tell me when to fly down. And yes, I'll bring the matcha." Behind the building, the alley was dark but still. Ellie stepped out and set a wrapped sandwich and a lidded cup of coffee on the back stoop. She didn't look around. She didn't need thanks. She simply placed the bundle where she'd seen a quiet figure settle most nights, a man with a knit cap pulled low, shoulders always hunched, eyes always watching. She turned and went back inside. The next morning, the paper cup was empty, the sandwich gone, and a crumpled napkin had been left in its place, neatly folded, as if to say something without saying anything at all. The days passed in a rhythm of hammering and phone calls. Jonas arrived early, radio crackling with blues guitar and baseball stats. Ellie painted sample color swatches on the walls, then wiped them away again. Kids passed by on the way to the school auditorium, rehearsing Thanksgiving lines and giggling over stage directions. The town moved around them, oblivious. That Friday, Ellie opened her email and found a message from her mother. The subject line read, "Transition Plan for Diner Finances." She clicked it open. "Ellie. We've hired a financial consulting firm to manage operations going forward. Your access to the books is no longer needed. Just focus on your next steps. No need to reply. Mom. She stared at the screen for a long time. There was no signature. No thank you. No acknowledgement of the years she'd balanced ledgers, trimmed food waste, renegotiated supplier contracts. Just like that, it was over. She didn't cry. Instead, she printed the email, folded it neatly, and slid it into a folder labeled reasons. As she pushed open the warehouse door that afternoon, Jonas looked up from sanding a plank of oak. He studied her face, the set of her mouth. They're cutting you loose, he said. Ellie nodded. Jonas set the sander down and walked over, brushing dust from his jeans. He reached into his tool belt and pulled out a pencil stub, then offered it to her like a gift. They're cutting you loose. That's not a loss, it's a release. The first customer came in with the sunrise. The second brought 5 friends. Ellie stood behind the counter, her hands folded calmly, watching the door open with a low jingle that still felt too new to be familiar. Outside, the sky blushed with early light, and frost glazed the edges of the front window. The scent of cinnamon scones mingled with freshly ground espresso, and soft jazz drifted from a retro speaker perched behind the bar. The walls, paneled in smooth pine, caught the morning light like a breath held in gold. She had spent the last 3 hours arranging the pastry display, checking every detail twice, chalkboard menus wiped clean, napkin holders filled, ceramic mugs aligned perfectly. And now, finally, a man in a gray cardigan stepped in, removed his cap, and inhaled like he'd walked into a memory. Smells like November ought to, he said. Ellie smiled. Welcome to Elm and Vine. By 7:30, the small line curved out the door. A group of retired teachers from the book club brought their folded newspaper crosswords and sat by the window. A young couple ordered 2 lattes and shared a single cranberry scone. Behind the bar, Jonas worked the espresso machine with a quiet competence that made him look a decade younger. He handed drinks over the counter with easy conversation and an occasional story about the wood that made up the bar top. Came from an old church pew, he told one woman, tapping the grain. Ellie picked it herself. Said it had stories baked in. Mrs. Leona arrived just before 8. She wore a teal coat with pearl buttons and a brooch shaped like a turkey. Ellie brought her order before she could ask of black coffee, sweet potato muffin warmed just enough to soften the center. Leona smiled, slid a 20 across the counter, and waved off Ellie's polite protest. You remember the people who remember you, dear. Keep the change. Ellie grinned and glanced at the chalkboard menu. The handwriting was hers. So was the layout. So was the dream. From her place at the counter, she noticed a figure across the street. Mr. Ray, bundled in his patched jacket, sat on the edge of the old bus bench. His eyes tracked the line through the cafe window, then settled on Ellie. She met his gaze just long enough to offer a nod. He returned it. Nothing more. The rush ebbed mid-morning, just as Ellie began resetting the pastry case. She looked up to see a familiar silhouette at the door. Candace stepped in without a word. Her coat was sharp, her lipstick perfect, her expression unreadable. She surveyed the cafe in a single glance, then moved to the counter. Latte. Oat milk, extra hot. Ellie keyed it in. Name. Candace raised an eyebrow. Ellie smiled, faint. Just kidding. Jonas slid the finished drink across. Watch out, this one bites. Candace took the cup but didn't sip. She didn't compliment the design. She didn't ask how things were going. She simply looked around once more, then turned and walked out, her heels clipping a slow rhythm across the tile. Ellie exhaled quietly. The place was still full. The warmth hadn't left. Later that afternoon, while wiping down the corner table near the window, Ellie's phone buzzed in her apron. A notification from Facebook lit the screen. Mrs. Leona, this cafe feels like someone brewed comfort with brains. The post already had 30 shares and over 100 comments, many with names Ellie recognized from church, the library, the community garden. She scrolled for a second, touched but not surprised. Mrs. Leona saw things. She always had. Behind her, Jonas was telling a story about a countertop that used to be a bowling lane. Laughter rippled from the bar. Ellie stepped into the back kitchen to grab more napkins. The phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Facebook. A text, unknown number. Just one line. Your concept has heart. I'd like to meet. AR. The smell of roasted pecans drifted from elm and vine. Across the street, Moore's Diner burned toast. The air that Wednesday morning was crisp enough to make breath visible, swirling like steam off coffee mugs as Ellie propped the cafe door open to catch the breeze. Holiday banners fluttered along the town square, and someone from the mayor's office was stringing pine garlands along the lampposts. From a portable speaker near the Crafts tent, Bing Crosby's voice floated through the air, singing about silver bells. Inside Elm and Vine, the ovens were working overtime. Jonas had arrived early to test a pecan maple glaze for the morning muffins, which now sat cooling on the rack in perfect golden rows. Ellie adjusted the chalkboard menu, stepping back to check alignment, her apron dusted with flour she hadn't noticed. Across the street, a new sign appeared in Moore's window. Moore's New Breakfast Bistro, Holiday Launch. The font looked suspiciously familiar. The layout even more so. Ellie blinked once, then moved on. By mid-morning, the cafe was humming. Locals passed in and out carrying boxes of pies from the craft tables. A middle school choir rehearsed softly under the gazebo, their harmonies drifting through the air like candle smoke. Ellie wiped the counter slowly as Jonas approached with 2 steaming mugs. Word is someone from Moore's tried to hire me yesterday, he said casually. Said they needed someone who knew their way around wood and workflow. Ellie raised an eyebrow. I told them I was already taken. He sipped. Guess I'm not so retired after all. She smiled but said nothing. A little after 10, a woman stepped inside, mid-60s, graceful without trying. She wore a camel-colored coat and soft leather gloves, her salt and pepper hair pulled back in a low twist. Her eyes moved across the space with quiet interest, pausing on the lighting, the seating layout, the bar. Lovely place, she said. Ellie approached. Welcome to Elm and Vine. First time here? The woman nodded. I was passing through. Thought I'd see what the buzz was about. Ellie offered a sample of cinnamon tea. We steep it with orange peel and cloves. Small town recipe. Big town flavor. The woman accepted the cup, warming her hands around it. You designed all this? Ellie glanced around, thoughtful. Some of it. The rest came from people who believed in the idea. They spoke a few minutes about pastries, reclaimed wood, and small business holidays. The woman never gave her name, but her questions were sharp, intelligent, layered beneath a veil of friendliness. As she turned to leave, Mr. Ray, seated as usual on the bench just beyond the bakery window, lifted his head and offered her a slight nod. She nodded back. Ellie caught the exchange but said nothing. That afternoon, in the lull between lunch and the pre-dinner rush, Ellie's phone buzzed with a notification. A new review had been posted for Elm and Vine. She clicked the link, expecting something warm. Instead, the words were curt and cutting, overhyped and overpriced. Just another hipster cafe pretending to have soul. The username was generic, the profile newly created. Ellie's stomach turned, not at the words, but at the IP trace that followed. Jonas, curious and mildly tech-savvy, had installed a tracker for fun last week. The post had come from a device inside Moore's Diner. Ellie stared at the screen, then closed the tab. No anger. No response. She stood, wiped her hands on her apron, and stepped into the back kitchen. A few hours later, the sun slipping toward the horizon, she crossed the street with a simple box tied in twine. Inside were 2 pecan muffins, 3 tea bags, and a small card. She left it at Moore's back door, tucking it beside the utility handle before stepping away. The card simply read, "Wishing you a warm holiday." Thanksgiving morning in Beaufort smelled like cinnamon, pine needles, and possibility. The town park shimmered in soft autumn light. Folding tables stretched under the oak trees, each one covered with hand-knit cloths and lined with casseroles, crockpots, and ceramic pie dishes. American flags fluttered gently from the gazebo, and the crisp air carried the warm hum of neighbors greeting each other like old friends. Children ran between benches with paper pilgrim hats. Somewhere in the distance, a barbershop quartet tuned their harmonies for the midday performance. Ellie stood near the refreshment table, setting out the last of elm and vine spiced cider. The scent of cloves rose into the air. Beside the cider sat 3 pies, pecan, apple, and buttermilk, each one labeled in neat handwriting, their crusts golden and honest. She paused, brushing a crumb from her apron, and scanned the crowd beginning to trickle in. Jonas arrived first, carrying a folding chair and a toolbox, just in case these tables wobble like last year, he said. Mrs. Leona followed close behind, clutching a bundt cake and wearing a sweater that looked like it had once belonged to someone's festive great-aunt. By 10, the park was nearly full. Ellie moved between tables, checking labels, helping an elderly man with a crock-pot plug, and offering napkins to toddlers wearing more cranberry sauce than clothes. Then she saw him. Mr. Ray walked up the gravel path slowly, his coat freshly brushed, a clean knit cap pulled snug around his head. In his hand was a folded chair, old but polished, and tucked under his arm was a newspaper. When he reached the pie table, Ellie stepped toward him. "Morning," she said, gentle as always. He looked at her for a moment longer than usual, then nodded once and said, "Smells better than Christmas." She handed him a plate and a cup of cider. He took them without a word and found a seat near the edge of the gathering, eyes always scanning, but for once, they didn't look tired. As the sun edged higher, Ellie noticed a familiar figure weaving through the crowd. The woman from the cafe, the one with the camel coat and composed grace. Today, she wore a wool scarf and carried a small glass dish wrapped in linen. She moved toward Mr. Ray and took the empty seat beside him without asking. They didn't speak at first. Just sat side by side, watching the town enjoy itself. Ellie walked over slowly, unsure of her place in whatever this was. "Happy Thanksgiving," she offered. The woman looked up, then smiled. "You've built something special." Ellie glanced at the rows of folding tables, the mismatched chairs, the kids spilling cider. "It's not much, but it's honest." The woman gestured to Mr. Ray. "My father would say honesty is the rarest luxury these days." Ellie's breath caught slightly. She turned to Mr. Ray, whose eyes crinkled at the corners. She started, then stopped. "You're her father." He nodded once. Alice Rayburn stood and extended a hand. "Alice. Alice Rayburn." Ellie took it, still stunned. "My father spent 40 years on Wall Street," Alice said. "When he retired, he wanted to see the world through quieter eyes. So he left the towers, the titles, the noise. Said he'd only know the truth of people if he met them when they had no idea who he was." Mr. Ray sipped his cider, then spoke slowly. "Not everyone passed the test." Alice placed a hand on her father's arm and looked back at Ellie. "But you did. You didn't just offer food. You offered dignity." Ellie felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I didn't do anything special. That's what made it special." The next moment passed without a word. Then Alice reached into her coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a document, short, formal, elegant. "I'd like to invest in you," she said. 5 more elm and vines across the southeast. Full creative control. Your vision, your pace. I'll handle the rest." Ellie blinked. "Why?" "Because kindness deserves to grow," Alice said. "And you built something the world doesn't have enough of." The corners of Ellie's mouth lifted, not into a smile exactly, but something steadier. A few minutes later, Ellie walked back toward the pie table to check on the rest of the donations. As she passed by the cider stand, she caught sight of her family. Diane was stirring a bowl of mashed sweet potatoes. Harold sat beside her, talking with an old neighbor. And Candace stood a few feet away, arms crossed, her eyes following everything, but her face unreadable. Ellie looks toward Candace, who stands stiffly at the pie table, watching everything with folded arms. Ellie never imagined success would look like a kitchen table, 2 coffee mugs, and her parents trying not to cry. The apartment was still, lit only by the afternoon sun spilling through gauzy curtains. Ellie slid a slim folder across the table. Inside were 2 documents, one, a cleanly worded buyout of Moore's Diner, the other, a check with their names printed neatly at the top, monthly retirement payments, already automated. No strings, Ellie said softly, her fingers resting on the ceramic mug. Just thanks. Diane blinked quickly and looked down, her lips parting but saying nothing. Harold cleared his throat, then glanced out the window like something urgent waited in the clouds. They didn't ask questions. Maybe they knew they'd already asked too many of the wrong ones in the past. The following Monday, the newly named Moore and Vine Cafe reopened with no fanfare, just the soft clink of dishes, the glow of fresh garlands over the windows, and the scent of nutmeg and balsam in the air. The original Moore's sign had been restored and mounted above the fireplace inside, cleaned but untouched, a tribute to the legacy that started it all. Ellie stood just inside the entrance, holding a clipboard and watching the final touches fall into place. The windows bore gentle stenciled snowflakes, and a string of plaid ribbons wove through the ceiling beams. A chalkboard near the counter listed holiday specials and Sophia's flourished script, eggnog scones, peppermint bark biscotti, cranberry compote toast. Candace arrived just before opening, her hair pulled back, her apron plain. She held a notepad, the edges curled, the handwriting on the cover distinctly her own. "I have some ideas," she said without preamble. "I don't know if they're any good, but I thought, maybe the brunch menu." Ellie looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Let's look at them together. But we'll test before we serve." Candace almost smiled. "Fair." By noon, the place was full of warmth and voices. The potluck had begun. Jonas brought venison chili and a tray of tiny, dangerously strong coffee shots. Mrs. Leona delivered 3 pies and a gingerbread tree that leaned dramatically to one side. Alice sat near the fireplace with Mr. Ray, her father, who wore a green sweater and nodded politely at each person who greeted him. Ellie moved through the room with calm confidence, answering questions, adjusting chairs, slipping plates to quiet guests. She wasn't flashy, but the space bent gently around her presence. Near the end of the evening, Mrs. Leona approached with a slim package wrapped in brown paper and tied with red yarn. Ellie unwrapped it carefully and found an old black and white photo, her grandmother in 1957, standing behind the original Moore's Diner counter, her hands on her hips, smile wide. On the back, in faded pen, someone had written, "Let kindness feed the hungry." Ellie held it for a moment, her fingers grazing the corner, then placed it on the mantel between a pine garland and a small framed menu from the opening week of Elm and Vine. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the lights had dimmed, Ellie stepped into her office. The expansion board stood tall against the far wall, each location neatly marked with a small brass pin. Nashville. Savannah. Raleigh. Jacksonville. She picked up the last pin from her desk, turned it between her fingers, and pressed it into the upper right corner, Portland, Maine. She smiles and says, "Let's see how far heart can travel." On a quiet December evening, the warmth inside Moore and Vine glowed brighter than the holiday lights outside, not because of profit or applause, but because of something deeper, something earned. Ellie's journey had not been loud or grand, but steady, kind, and unseen by many until it mattered most. In a world quick to judge by appearance or title, she proved that dignity can rise from silence and that quiet hands often carry the strongest purpose. Like a candle left in the window on a cold night, one small act of kindness can light the way home, for others, and sometimes, for ourselves. And perhaps, in your own quiet corner of the world, there's someone waiting for that same gentle light.